Everything looks the same, but nothing works anymore. This could be the unspoken sentence of many modern men. We live in a time where it is said that men and women are entirely equal in rights, in capabilities, in desires, in roles. This claim, on the surface, seems unquestionable, but there's a difference between equality of value and equivalence of function, and it's precisely this confusion that throws us into the silent abyss of identity. Imagine a 35-year-old man, raised to respect, to listen, to yield. He enters a relationship where his partner naturally takes the lead. She decides, organizes, proposes, directs. He, obedient and kind, follows along. But something begins to rot inside. He doesn't feel gratitude, he feels anger. A silent, nameless anger. Not because she is oppressive, but because he no longer knows who he is. Rousseau, the philosopher of the social contract and the noble savage, may not be the most popular figure today, but there's something disturbingly current in his insights. For him, civilization distanced us from our nature. By imposing conventions, it suffocated our authentic impulses. And one of those impulses, rarely discussed, is the symbolic structure of the masculine and the feminine. Rousseau didn't say that women should be submissive because they are inferior. He said there are distinct forces with their own languages. For him, the woman influences not through direct imposition, but through a shaping, subtle, almost invisible presence. The man, in contrast, needs the tension of confrontation, the responsibility of leadership, the pain of choosing not to dominate, but to become whole. When we ignore these differences and promote a mechanical equality, we're actually imposing a lie that demands men and women pretend to be identical versions of the same human being, when as if biology, psyche, and history hadn't left deep imprints on our ways of being. This lie doesn't scream, it erodes. And Rousseau, with all his contradictions, may have been one of the first to point out that the price of civilization might be precisely the forgetting of who we are. Before theories, before social roles, before slogans, Rousseau believed that man is born good, and it is society that corrupts him, a phrase repeated to exhaustion, often without the weight of the tragedy it carries. For him, civilization is not just a set of laws and institutions, but a machine that deforms desires, suffocates instincts, and homogenizes souls. In the name of order, we lose touch with what truly made us human. And what is the human? In Rousseau, it's the creature that feels before thinking, that acts out of compassion before calculating gains. It's the solitary being who doesn't need to dominate the other to exist, but is forced to when thrown into the social game. Politics, for Rousseau, is born of fear and competition, and it's in that environment that man begins to stray from his truth. But there is a subtle exception in this chaos: the woman. Rousseau saw in her a different archetypal function. Not a warrior nor a legislator, but a sort of formative force of social morality. It's no accident that he placed her at the center of sentimental education. For Rousseau, a woman teaches without dominating, guides without commanding. Her influence doesn't operate in the public sphere, but in the intimate shaping of affections, where true culture begins. The problem is not with women leading. The problem is imagining that they must lead like men, in the same way, with the same logic, on the same stage. By doing so, we ignore that there are different ways to exercise influence. A woman who tries to lead like a man often comes into conflict with her own instincts, and the man who is led without resistance loses his backbone. Modern culture has turned everything into a fight for space. But not everything is about space. Some things are about place, and place here doesn't mean hierarchy, but center of gravity. The feminine, for Rousseau, was that center, not the top of a pyramid, but the heart of a symbolic constellation. And what happens when we switch those places? Morality becomes performance. Education turns into imposition. Affection becomes calculation. Rousseau didn't write it exactly like this. He lived in another century, another language, other oppressions. But between the lines of his thinking, there's a warning. The human being cannot live against their nature for long without falling ill. Today, we confuse equality with symmetry, but the soul is not symmetrical. And when we try to force it to be, everything begins to creak. Marriages, children, bonds, work. It's here that Rousseau becomes, paradoxically, more radical than any modern equality theorist. He demands that we look inward and recognize that not all difference is injustice. Some differences are the very condition for balance. In the past 100 years, something has been silently dismantled, not by the hands of a villain, but through the gradual erosion of symbols that once upheld the invisible order of human experience. Among them, perhaps the most wounded, is the father. The father, not the provider or the authoritarian, but the archetype, the figure who carries the weight of direction, responsibility, and limit. Not one who imposes fear, but one who endures, saying no, who says enough when everyone wants more, who points north not with shouts but with presence. With the advance of modernity, this figure has been emptied, first in the family, then in culture, then in language. The collective discourse began to see the father as a remnant of oppression, a disposable figure, a symbol of patriarchy to be overcome. And like every symbol that dissolves, the collapse of the father left a vacuum, and vacuums are always filled. In that vacuum, many women began to lead. Not out of desire, but necessity. Not because they wanted to guide men, but because men stopped guiding themselves. The woman took on the role of guide not out of natural vocation, but because beside her stood a man drained of conviction. If Rousseau were alive today, he might look upon this scene with a mix of sadness and astonishment. Because in the world he imagined, man became free only when he learned to govern himself. And that learning wasn't spontaneous. It depended on the transmission of an authority, not authoritarian, but symbolic, the authority that structures the spirit. When that transmission is broken, the man becomes an orphan, not of affection, but of destiny. He grows up without models, without boundaries, without resistance. And like everything in life that doesn't find form, he spreads into vices, into hesitations, into nameless violence. He no longer knows how to lead, neither himself nor others. The tragedy is that even when the woman assumes the leadership role, she rarely finds fulfillment. Because in her archetypal depth, she does not desire to govern the man. She desires to trust him, not because she is weak, but because she knows that in order to love, she must be able to surrender. And to surrender, there must be someone capable of receiving. The collapse of the paternal figure didn't just take away men's direction, it took away women's rest. Both halves have become exhausted. He from lack of purpose, she from the weight of overload. And modern culture, which claimed to be liberating, produced a generation of inert men and overburdened women, both longing for something they never even knew. There is a kind of suffering that doesn't appear in diagnoses or public discourse, but that silently shapes the lives of millions of men. It is the pain of not knowing how to lead, not from incapacity, but from the absence of a mirror. From early on, many men are taught to suppress their impulses, soften their gestures, repress their instinct to confront. They are raised to be gentle, adaptable, understanding. All this sounds fair. Until one day, they wake up in relationships where they've lost the right to decide. They no longer know how to say no longer know how to fight. And the most tragic part, they believe this is virtue. This is where resentment begins to grow. A resentment not toward the woman, but toward themselves, toward their own passivity, toward the feeling that something essential was amputated, the ability to take a stand, to lead with strength, to protect not just the other, but their own integrity. Jung, when exploring the archetypes of the psyche, pointed to the importance of integrating the inner king, the part of the man that governs himself with legitimate authority. When this archetype fails to form, the man drifts, always waiting to be guided, but no man can endure this waiting for long without falling ill. Rousseau didn't address this with the language of depth psychology, but his philosophy echoed the same concern. Freedom is not spontaneous, it is built, and it's only possible when the man is challenged, when he has someone to confront, someone to receive limits from, someone to mirror. Masculine leadership in this sense is not about control, but about embodying a center of coherence. Yet contemporary culture promotes a model where the man must follow, not lead, must yield but never confront, must listen but never assert. And when a man internalizes this model, he becomes absent, even when present, a body that walks, works, coexists, but doesn't inhabit his own existence. And the woman, facing this void, takes command. But something inverts within her, because leadership without resistance becomes a burden. And the man who doesn't react, who doesn't propose, who doesn't take risks, does not inspire trust, only compassion. The relationship becomes unstructured, not from lack of love, but from symbolic dysfunction. The woman cannot respect someone who doesn't assert himself, and the man, feeling invisible, begins to drift away, first in silence, then in vices, in absences, in nameless crises. It is this orphaned masculinity, without father, without direction, without spine, that defines the modern male malaise. A malaise not cured by slogans, but by the patient rebuilding of what was lost. The courage to lead, not over others, but over oneself. There is a vast difference between leading and merely reflecting. And this difference, ignored by modern logic, is what separates the deep bond of symbolic relationship from the silent dysfunction of emotional imbalance. The woman, when seen seen as a mirror, is not passive, she is revealing. Her presence doesn't impose direction, but reflects back to the man the image of who he is becoming. When the man stands firm in his center, the woman amplifies him. When he is lost, she exposes him. She doesn't guide him with commands, but confronts him with what he's forgotten to see. This is one of the greatest feminine powers, the ability to reveal without demanding, to hold the space where a man can finally become who he is if he has the courage. But when that function inverts, when the woman must command, organize, provide direction, something fragments, not because she is incapable, but because she steps into a space that requires a different energy, an energy of imposition, of vertical direction, that doesn't align with her integrative nature. The result is emotional exhaustion. She leads, but feels alone. He obeys, but feels emasculated. Love doesn't vanish, it changes form, it becomes weight, and intimacy turns into a field of silent resentments. She is irritated by his lack of initiative. He resents her constant leadership. Rousseau, even with his historical limitations, sensed this dynamic. He saw in the woman a moral educator, a kind of civilizing presence that doesn't act through force, but through influence. Influence that comes through the gaze, through gestures, through the emotional atmosphere she establishes. He didn't speak of equal roles, but of complementarity of forces, not hierarchical, but symbolic. Jung expanded this by saying that the masculine and feminine dwell within each of us, but their balance requires recognition, not denial. When a man becomes only receptive, he comes into conflict with his animus. And the woman, when she takes on the directive role without support, collapses under the weight of a masculinity that isn't hers. This isn't about preventing women from leading, but about recognizing that certain spaces require specific forms of energy, and that the harmony between man and woman is not built through competition, but through the fitting together of distinct powers. One doesn't need to do what the other does. They need to be what the other needs to find. The woman, as mirror, holds the silence where the man can see himself. But if she takes the word before he finds his own voice, he will never learn to speak, not to the world, nor to her. A man who waits too long becomes dangerous, not to others, but to himself. We live in a time that praises the self-assured, deconstructed, at peace man. But often, what is presented as balance is merely paralysis. The man who never asserts himself, who never enters conflict, who avoids all tension in the name of harmony, is often just hiding behind a mask of virtue. That passivity, polished on the outside, rots on the inside, because the male soul was made for confrontation with reality, not brute, destructive confrontation, but that which demands presence, clarity, and decision. When the man is not called to assert himself, he empties, and in place of strength, a silent resentment grows, not against the woman, nor the world, but against himself. Nietzsche, in speaking of the last man, had already sensed this hollowing out, a human being who no longer desires anything, who takes no risks, who merely consumes and protects himself, a domesticated man, amputated from his will to power. This is the fate of the man who abdicates leadership over himself, and this abdication, however subtle, exacts a devastating toll on relationships. Because the woman may take the helm for a time, but deep down she seeks someone who knows how to row with strength, who takes the risk of being wrong, who decides with his whole being, who says this way, not out of arrogance, but from conviction. When the man does not assume this direction, the relationship enters symbolic collapse. She leads but cannot surrender. He follows but no longer recognizes himself. And in this silent reversal, desire dies. Admiration dies, meaning dies. Rousseau, even writing from another time, seemed to understand that man is only worthy of freedom when he learns to self-govern. And this self-governance requires will, presence, and structure. It's not built with neutrality, it's built with risk. Passive masculinity is, at its core, a form of surrender. And every surrender accrues interest over time, because what isn't fully lived becomes chronic anguish. And nothing destroys a man more than living as if he weren't alive. True leadership doesn't need to shout. It begins in the silence of one who knows himself. There is a type of man who doesn't need to dominate anyone to be respected. He doesn't impose, he upholds. He doesn't dodge weight, doesn't outsource responsibility, doesn't hide behind convenient speeches. And when a woman meets him, she doesn't need to armor herself. She can at last rest. Rousseau wasn't a prophet of female submission. He was a cartographer of the human condition. And what he saw, even without modern terms, was that the symbolic order between the sexes is not sustained by laws or conventions, but by a delicate dance of archetypal functions. When this dance is forgotten, everything becomes a struggle. When it's remembered, everything aligns. The man who becomes quiet to hear his inner truth is not weak. he is powerful, because only one who has faced his own emptiness can later uphold another. And the woman who does not lead is not submissive. She is the center. She anchors, reveals, reflects. In the end, it's not about who commands, but about who sustains the invisible ground on which the other can finally be. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Rousseau was trying to tell us, beneath all his rigidity, that there are places not to be conquered, but inhabited.